Welcome to the border. I'm on the English side right now, but just behind me is the River Tweed, which separates England and Scotland. Just across over there, you can see the Scottish town of Coldstream, which of course is famous for giving its name to the regiment, the Coldstream Guards. But this field just next to us, despite being on the English side of the river, it's not actually part of England. It's Scotland. So if I were to walk a few steps backwards, I leave the land of Shakespeare and enter the land of Burns. But why is that?
For a large part of the border, the River Tweed marks the boundary for the two countries, with England on the south side of the river and Scotland on the north. But there's one interesting piece of land that's on the south side of the Tweed, where the border branches off for no real reason. A small meadow that, despite being on the English side, belongs to Scotland. So what's the story? Did some heroic Scottish army stand fast in the face of a huge English force that outnumbered them on this plot of land?
The real reason that Scotland owns this piece of land south of the Tweed, this field that's barely 3 acres, is actually a lot more wholesome. The men of Coldstream won it for Scotland in a game of football. Every new year, men from Coldstream would meet Englishmen from the nearby village of Wark, and they'd play for ownership of this field.
Unlike modern sports, these medieval games weren't played with a set number of players. This was mob football, and your team was as many people as you could muster from your town or village. But this leads us into why Scotland owns the field permanently. Coldstream's population was growing, meaning that more and more players were on the Scotland team. Wark, on the other hand, remained a small village, so an outnumbered English team would have found themselves losing the game every year, or simply agreeing that there was no point trying to compete anymore. The Treaty of York in 1237 was an agreement between Kings Henry III of England and Alexander II of Scotland. And this treaty affirmed Northumbria, Cumberland and Westmoreland as being under English sovereignty, and thus established a border that's remained almost unchanged, with the exception of the debatable lands and the town of Berwick. The Bar Green, this field, belonged to Scotland and not England, thanks to the enormous Coldstream team always beating the English team from Wark. And so it became Scotland permanently. Although, to reach it without setting foot in England, you'd need a small boat, or be fine with getting wet.
There isn't anything else to see here, it is literally just an empty field, but it's still a fascinating part of border history, I think. And as far as I'm aware, it's the only border in the world that was decided by a sports game.
What this piece of history shows, though, is that while England and Scotland were at war for centuries, the ordinary people from the two countries haven't always been at each other's throats. While both sides invaded the other, burned towns and villages, stole livestock, and made this place one of the bloodiest conflict zones in Europe, there was another side to it all. People married across the border, they worked across the border, they had family and friends across the borderline, and yes, they even played sports together across the border.
One last thing, if there's any Scots watching, I think it's time that we sort a rematch out very soon, because personally, I think this feels like England.